When you're trying to consolidate your authoritarianism, there are kind of three main targets. It's independent media, it's an independent judiciary, and it's science and academia. Those kind of three things. And that's exactly what we've seen in the Trump administration so far. So I think when it comes to science universities, one of the things that authoritarian regimes need, particularly populist ones, is they have to control the narrative. And you have this narrative, and this is what's happening in the world, and this is why I'm fixing it. And science doesn't work that way. Science is about taking evidence and drawing conclusions.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who've lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. Today, I am delighted to be speaking to Christina Pagel, Professor of Operational Research in Healthcare at University College London. Operational research is a pragmatic branch of mathematics to help people solve real-life problems. But Christina began her career in mathematics, and she has a PhD in space physics. She has an excellent newsletter called Diving into Data and Decision-Making, where she has recently turned her attention to mapping and explaining the Trump administration's retreat from science and its authoritarian attacks on science and universities. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Christina.
Thank you.
Firstly, can I ask you, how do you see the connection between what you do professionally in operational research and your writings on United States politics?
I mean, I wouldn't say there's a super close link. So my academic work is all around using operational research in health services in general and around health services delivery. And I've now been working in that for 20 years. But as time has gone on, I've kind of moved away from doing really kind of detailed mathematical projects to looking more at a systems level view of what are some of the root causes of issues and how can we address them? How can we work with policymakers and so on? And so from that point of view, I think that there is kind of a natural link in the things that are happening in the US directly affect health policy there and internationally. But also, just from a personal point of view, I mean, I think this idea that scientists can divorce themselves from the political context around them and their private life, I don't think is really true. And I find it deeply worrying seeing what's happening in the US and this kind of undermining of democracy and democratic institutions and science and fact and public health. And I feel just a responsibility as an individual to try and make sense of it. And trying to make sense of it for myself led me into writing about it on my Substack to try and help other people make sense of it, or at least share my views. So that's kind of where that's come from. I just feel like I need to do something.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I guess what attracted me to your writing was that you do take an analytical approach. Perhaps, you were trained as a mathematician and a physicist. Can you tell me about the Trump Action Tracker, which is something you launched rather recently that also takes almost a quantitative approach to understanding what's going on in the United States?
Yeah, so when Trump was inaugurated in, end of January, and just those first few weeks, there was so much happening. And it felt like it was a qualitatively different thing to his first term. And although people have been talking about, his cabinet picks and assaults on science and so on, it just felt more than people thought. And so just try and make sense of it. I then actually just went through and just wrote down everything that had happened in like the last 3 weeks. This was middle of February. And I kind of mapped it to these kind of broad domains of authoritarian regimes, whether that's, undermining the rule of law, to attacking science, to suppressing dissent and so on. And that really helped me to kind of get an overview of quite how broad the assault was and how lots of little different actions could come together to create quite a disturbing whole. And it also seemed to resonate with a lot of people. It was really my most popular post ever. And once I'd started, I thought, well, I'll just keep going. And it was this Google sheet and it just kept going. And then I was like, well, somehow I want to make this more publicly accessible to people. And so I worked with some volunteers. And together we've turned it into a website that people can now look at. It has charts on it. Every single action comes with a link so that people can go and read about it themselves. So it's not just my opinion on things. We're keeping it up to date, and we're probably going to hit 900 actions this weekend.
And that's at trumpactiontracker.info, right?
Yeah, that's where the website is. And we're still trying to improve it. We're going to try and add functionality so people can download the data themselves and download subsets of it. And it's just a way of keeping track, because it's so easy to be overwhelmed by what's happening that you can just miss things. And so, it just lets you kind of say, actually, what happened in July? What happened in February? What happened in suppressing dissent? How has that changed over time with the kind of escalation of the use of ICE, for instance, and the National Guard? And that's kind of what I'm hoping it becomes, like a resource for others to write their own things. You just kind of link things over time, which I think are hard to do otherwise.
It is. And I mean, I do find it's almost reassuring in the sense that I feel like I can turn to it to get a sense of what's going on. Because sometimes, I mean, in one day, this week, I felt like the thing that kind of really blew me away was the RFK Jr.'s cancellation of funding for mRNA research. But that was just like one of like 10 different assaults on decency that have happened since Monday. But can you tell me why there are 5 categories that you're using? I think you originally came up with them in something that you wrote for your newsletter, and now that's the way you're logging them on the Trump Action Tracker. So it's undermining democratic institutions and rule of law and dismantling federal government is one. Suppressing dissent and controlling information is another. A third is dismantling social protections and rights, enrichment and corruption. The fourth is attacking science, environment, health, arts, and education. And the final and fifth one is aggressive foreign policy and global destabilization and nationalism. How did you decide on these 5 categories?
So originally, they were, I think, 8 or 9. And I wanted to show them visually, and I wanted to kind of show them in a Venn diagram, because a lot of actions fall into more than one category. But you can't show 9 circles in a Venn. You can't show all the intersections at all. So 5 is about as many as you can do. And so I had to collapse them into broader groups. So that's why some of them are combined. So you've kind of got suppressing dissent and controlling information as a combination of suppression, like arrests, tougher legislation, intimidation to shut voices, but also things like putting out misinformation, conspiracy theories, trying to limit media access to things, reducing access to data. All of that kind of would go into that. So that's why some of them have kind of been joined together. It was a kind of quite a pragmatic decision early on, just because of the visuals. And I just was like, well, I'll just keep it like that. But one of the things I want to do with the website in the future is maybe to have subsections where you can split it out again and look at different aspects of those different categories. It's just that at the moment, it all depends on me doing it in my spare time and some volunteers. And there's just a limit to what we can do without kind of proper funding. So that's where we are.
Right. And maybe I should make a call out to any listeners that Christina is looking for some volunteers for the Trump Action Tracker project. So a very worthy cause, a very worthy project. So why do autocrats fear science and universities? What is it, do you think, with Trump and academia?
I think the first thing to realize, this isn't a Trump thing. The kind of authoritarian regimes over the last, 100 years, when you're trying to consolidate your authoritarianism, there are kind of 3 main targets. It's independent media, it's an independent judiciary, and it's science and academia. Those kind of 3 things. And that's exactly what we've seen in the Trump administration so far. So I think when it comes to science universities, one of the things that authoritarian regimes need, particularly populist ones, is they have to control the narrative. And you have this narrative, and this is what's happening in the world, and this is why I'm fixing it. And science doesn't work that way. Science is about taking evidence and drawing conclusions and creating its own objective truths. And that is a direct threat to autocracies which rely on having their own version of what's happening. It's a very different type of evidence making that just doesn't fit well. And the other big feature of science is that it's transnational, that it involves a lot of collaboration. It's very mobile. People move between cities, between countries and spread ideas. And that, again, is a threat to authoritarian regimes who don't really want that kind of independent sharing of information, I think, which is partly also why they attack the media, because you kind of have these ways of holding governments to account. One of it is by producing evidence that evaluates policies and evaluates what's happening, and the other one is telling people about it. And both of those are threats to authoritarian regimes.
Let's talk about the way authoritarian governments can capture scientific institutions. What has your research taught you about how, we might look at the Trump administration's attitude and actions when it comes to science and scientific institutions?
Yeah, so what you're seeing in the US, and you can see actually in various other examples, is that there are lots of different ways that you can undermine the independence of institutions. And what is quite worrying is that a lot of those ways aren't that visible to the public. They're hard to report on, and they're hard to get people kind of riled up about, but incredibly effective. And we're currently doing a project in the UK looking at the vulnerability of our independent institutions to these kinds of things. So it's things like the most obvious one, you just abolish them. But beyond that, it's personnel capture. It's if you have power to appoint leadership, you can actually, by installing loyalists, you can massively change the function and the feasibility of an agency. It's, do agencies have the right to publish independent of government control? If you can impose censorship, or if you insist on, as a regime, if you insist on having oversight of everything that's public, that's another way of restricting the information that's coming out. Choking off funding, which we can talk about a bit more because there are lots of ways of doing that, but certainly that's another way. Priority setting, and then changing accountability structures, which is a really kind of technical thing, but it's really important. So for instance, if you have, as an agency, you're directly accountable either to Congress or in the UK to Parliament, then in a sense, you have a lot more independence because you can directly report on your functions. If that starts being mediated through the executive, then it risks your voice being choked off. And that's happened already to some institutions in the UK, and it's definitely happening in the US. So, and every single one of those things, the Trump administration have done that. He's installed loyalists who are very skeptical of the missions of those agencies throughout, whether that's NIH, NASA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the CDC, the FDA, and they are setting priorities that are very different to what was set before. Funding has been slashed for pretty much all of them substantially. They've also introduced censorship of publications. You're not now allowed to publish on certain topics. They've removed websites. They're shutting down satellites. They're shutting down data streams. You're seeing just this week with the firing of the head of the data release for the Office of Labour Statistics, how when you release data that doesn't reflect well on the regime, you're fired. I mean, all of these things are creating an environment where those kind of independent agencies can't do their job of either generating evidence or regulation or holding government to account.
I lived in China for a long time. It is sadly reminiscent of at least the way China used to be. I mean, I think in some ways, remarkably, there seems to be more respect for facts in the Chinese Communist Party than there is among the Republicans right now. But can you talk a little bit about the connection between public health or its neglect and authoritarian governance? Or perhaps, we chatted a little bit before we recorded about this. It's not necessarily authoritarian, but certainly the increasingly nationalist and right-wing authoritarian governments, such as the Trump administration. Why do they have their attitude to public health that they have? How do we understand it? Because sometimes it seems really crazy to me what is being done to the health system in this country, that it's actually going to harm the people that put Trump and his cronies into power.
I think part of it is how kind of right-wing populism, which is what the Trump administration is kind of tied in to this ethos of individualism, that everything is your own responsibility and the state should have no role in managing people's lives or supporting people's lives. And that means automatically that they're trying to take the state out of addressing any kind of structural inequalities or imbalances. In fact, they don't even believe in structural inequality. And inequality is a word that has now been banned from US research. But the whole of public health is about addressing structural inequalities. It is about saying the state has a role in supporting the health of people, whether that's providing clean water, clean air, regulating food to make sure it's not going to kill you, providing vaccinations to improve health, or creating environments that are healthier in terms of encouraging exercise or better eating habits. all of that takes away from this idea that everything is your own responsibility. And it kind of has also merged into this new kind of fight against wokeness. I mean, public health is woke in the sense that it cares about the people who are worst off, because you're trying to improve population health. And if you're trying to improve population health, you have to start with the people who are the least likely to be healthy, which are often the most marginalized and the most poor. And those are exactly the populations that tend to be demonized by populist governments. And so, for instance, in the UK, so much of our public health research funding is about, okay, well, how do we support the most deprived areas? How do we improve access for ethnic minorities or non-English speakers? How do we improve sexual health for trans populations or sex workers or whatever it happens to be? And all of those are topics which just are anathema to the current populist kind of ideologies. And so public health just falls by the wayside. And I don't think it's necessarily that they want to have a less healthy population, but that is the byproduct of it. And essentially the in crowd are going to be least affected by that. But the anti-vax stuff, I think that's quite new. I think it's quite new that this kind of weird conspiracy theory anti-science thing comes in. But if you, for the reasons we spoke about earlier, if you devalue science and scientific evidence, then that obviously allows space for you to bring in alternative facts. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think if you put in a different cabinet secretary instead of RFK, you wouldn't be seeing this wholesale assault on vaccines that we're seeing in the US. But for other reasons, for political reasons, he did bring in Kennedy, partly because he was wanting to run as a third candidate. And so you're seeing these kind of political choices to get power bleeding into quite important public health decisions in the US.
That is something that I am struggling to understand, because I sort of, like, I look at this mRNA, the cancellation of funding. I mean, if I was Donald Trump, I mean, pretty much an octogenarian with not great health habits, I would want like the best science to be happening in the US as regards prolonging my life. It seems so crazy that there is no resistance within the Trump administration itself to this anti-science attitude.
Well, Trump is going to be getting the best science to prolong his life. I think they will always access the healthcare that they need one way or another, even if it's not in the US. The mRNA thing is an RFK thing. I don't think it's necessarily something the administration would have approved if he wasn't in post. Like, there are all kinds of other, like all the environmental stuff, the anti-climate change stuff, that was always going to happen. But these very specific concerns, they're not something that Trump cares about. They're not something that Vance cares about. I don't think they're something necessarily that Project 2025 cared about. I think they're things that this certain sector now who've kind of gone into that care about, and that's why it's happening.
Right. So they brought RFK on because they needed his base, and it's going to happen just because he's the guy in place. But it's not something that was part of the plan originally.
I don't think it was, but I do think it is true that since COVID, you have seen the restrictions that happened with COVID for public health reasons completely weaponize this idea of you're interfering with my individual rights. And it kind of turbocharged the vaccine misinformation. And actually now there's a lot of money to be made in vaccine disinformation, especially if you're a scientist or you have some kind of medical qualification and you turn to that way, you can earn $1,000 quite easily by peddling it. And so I think you're seeing online as well that with the way the algorithms work, that once you start kind of getting into vaccine hesitancy, you quite quickly get led into other right-wing ideological broadcast and vice versa. And that has been documented in many places. And the same kind of with the burgeoning wellness industry, you're seeing with that, which comes from quite a good place of self-improvement, it's a gateway into all kinds of unproven treatments and skepticism about mainstream health and prevention.
How do you feel in the UK, like looking at this stuff? Because I remember when Brexit happened, I'm from South Africa originally, but I was living in the States and had become a citizen. And when Brexit happened, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, we have Trump, yeah, but we can get over it. Whereas now Britain has done this thing and you can't get over it. It's like you've already cursed the future. But I'm starting to reevaluate that idea now, because I feel as though in the United States, we've crossed some kind of Rubicon into some kind of crazy territory that is going to be very, very difficult to recover from. And the UK isn't actually there yet, but you're quite vulnerable to many of these same forces. Farage is, a popular politician. Starmer perhaps is not. When you look at the United States right now, does it make you fear for the UK's future?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. You're right. Farage is very popular. Reform are now polling first in all the polls. We don't have an election for 4 years, thankfully. I do think, though, that in the UK, Trump is very unpopular. Farage, while he is popular, is still unpopular, if you see what I mean. Like, none of the political leaders are popular. He's the most popular one, but it's still maybe 30% approval rating. I mean, it's not like most people like him. And I think our information system here isn't quite as polarized as the US. Like, it feels like in the US, you have one reality created by Fox News and the right-wing podcasters. And then you have, say, CNN, and then you might have MSNBC, and they're completely different. And there's no real overlap. Whereas here, I think you still have the BBC, you do have the main news channels, which have a legal obligation to be neutral that is enforced. And that creates some kind of shared national understanding of facts. So, the climate skepticism in the UK is very, very low. Vaccine skepticism it's rising, but it's still low. So in that sense, we're just not as polarized as the US. And we're also not quite as vulnerable to the kind of polarization you've seen in terms of kind of evangelicals going for Trump on kind of conservative issues, because the UK just isn't a particularly religious country. It's one of the least religious countries in the world. So in that sense, we have some safeguards, but, we don't have a constitution. So in terms of legal safeguards, there aren't that many. Everything's kind of done on convention, and this convention that people in power are there with good intentions. Now, if that stops being the case, if you have an executive come into power with a big majority and they're determined to tear down the state, there's actually very little you can do to stop them.
Although I would have to say that it feels like we have this constitution, but it still is kind of dependent on people being willing to respect it.
Well, I think the biggest issue in the US is that Congress was meant to be the third equal arm of the state, and it's not. It's acting as Donald Trump's arm. I mean, that's the thing. Like, the Republicans in Congress are not standing up for their own rights and entitlements, and they're letting Trump take decisions that are the purview of Congress. The courts are kind of doing their thing. The problem is, once Trump stops listening to court cases, then it's an issue. But in the UK, you wouldn't necessarily even be able to take people to court. So there's that one bit that is missing. I do think we have a problem in that we have massive inequality here, as you do in the US. And for very, very many people, life has just got worse over the last 12 years. And that's not sustainable. And I think if the current Labour government doesn't materially improve things for most people in 4 years, then there's going to be a backlash, because it's just going to encourage people to go, well, what's the point? Let's tear it down. I don't think that's the right answer, but I think that is a big risk.
From your position as a scientist, essentially, it's somebody who uses mathematics to understand the world, how do you think we should approach, if we oppose the Trump administration, what do you think are the most effective methods for actually enacting change and opposing what is going on here?
I think one of them is actually trying to oppose it. I was in a conversation with someone who had grown up in communist USSR and practiced as a scientist there. And then after the fall of the USSR, I'd moved to the West. But she said that you have maybe 3 or 4 years at the beginning of an authoritarian regime to challenge the status quo. And after that, people get used to it and they make their accommodations with it. And if you grow up in it, you don't know any different. You have to keep remembering what it could be like. And the longer it goes on, the harder that becomes. Already, I feel like remembering what it was like under Obama or even Biden, it feels like a completely different world compared to where we are now. So I was actually an author on this thing called the Anti-Autocracy Handbook for Scholars. So that was particularly aiming for people who are working in universities or in science institutions. But I thought it was really useful actually for a lot of people. So one of the things is, if you're thinking about individual actions you can do, is you do have to look at your own risk profile. How at risk are you from a clampdown from the state? So for instance, at the moment in the US, if you're on a visa and if you are, say, the main breadwinner in your household, or you're also part of a minority, or you've had past run-ins in the law, you're very, very vulnerable to deportation for speaking out. And so the things that you might be able to do are very different to a white male American citizen in a permanent job who doesn't have dependents. Do you see what I mean? So you kind of do have to think about where are you on that scale. And I think there is a responsibility on people who are at the least risk of reprisals to speak out more and to support people who are at more risk. I think when you're also looking at taking action, you have to take account in your own life, right? What is your online footprint? How much have you got online about where you live, where you were born, your social security number, things that could be used to attack you quite easily. I think we've been really careless about putting those online. We are already seeing this massive intimidation of lawyers and judges in the US and students and scientists and people who are speaking out in the media. And so I think it is actually quite important just to take stock of where you are. And then things you can do as a scientist, we can do things like safeguard data sets. The US holds so much of the world's data. And it's not just a question of it being US data sets that are being used globally. It's things like, most of the cloud services in the world are actually based in the US. They're American companies. It's Amazon, it's Google, it's Microsoft, that potentially those companies could be pressured or subpoenaed into either giving up that data or restricting access to non-American jurisdictions, right? We're used to a global data infrastructure, but actually we're very vulnerable if the US starts restricting it. And there are signs that could happen. So it's about things like, well, can you mirror data sets, store them locally in your own country and safeguard knowledge? Really? I mean, I think that is a really important thing that anyone can do. It's about talking to people around you. It's about reminding each other that this isn't normal. It's about trying to engage with disinformation where you see it, like for instance, I don't know, like my sister said something to me about vaccines the other day, which was not true. And normally, instead of just brushing it off and going, ha, you kind of go, actually, what is it that makes you think that? Why are you thinking that? And actually talking it through and starting to challenge things a bit, because I think peers are incredibly important in how you understand things. And then that kind of leads on to this strategy, which is called like deep conversations. And there's been quite a lot of research about it, where you really do try and talk to people who disagree with you in a way that isn't angry and it's not hectoring, but it's about understanding where people are coming from and the context in which they're saying these things, and then building a rapport and coming to an understanding of each other, because people aren't going to trust the information that you get unless they trust you. And so, you can't bypass that trust-making thing. And they're not going to trust information that you may have if they think that you despise them. There's often this mistake, and I see it on the left and the right, of real just contempt for people who have different views. And I think if you're coming from a place of contempt, you're never going to get anywhere.
It is. That is also one of, I think, the most difficult things to do. When I heard the news about the cancellation of the funding for mRNA research, I think one of my first reactions was feeling like all the people who voted for Trump deserve to die of some horrible disease that could have been prevented by this research. And I mean, that's a terrible thought. And I should be able to not think that way, but it's quite tough. I think that's for people who oppose the Trump administration. It's one of the most difficult things in America right now is how do you talk to people that have almost violent disagreement with you?
It is really tough. And maybe one really important thing is to recognize if that's not something that's going to be you, if you're not good at it, then maybe you're better off providing and creating information sources for people who are good at it that they can use when they have those conversations. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, it's not everybody has to do all of it. So other things that are really important, donating, like a lot of the opposition in the US is coming from civil rights organizations, from trade unions and labor unions, from health bodies that are taking administration to court over different decisions. And that takes time and money. So things like that, if you're in a position to donate that, amazing. Reaching out directly to congressmen and politicians. And I know that that's hard. And I think the problem is as well that people have become kind of very online, and I'm guilty of it as well, that you pour your outrage into the online world, but actually that's not as effective as doing it in the real world, because you're not changing anyone's mind really online. And whereas politicians do, if they see 1,000 emails on X, I mean, not on X, on topic something, then it does kind of seep into their information sphere and they, oh shit, well, maybe this is a problem. So with things like that, where we have to kind of check ourselves and say, well, one more tweet or one more post on Blue Sky is not going to change the world, however angry you are. And I do it as much as anyone else, but I also try and do stuff in real life too.
Meat space is still important. One last question, and I know you, in our chat previously, you expressed some reluctance to answer this, but why do you think people fall for the authoritarian shtick? Why are they attracted to authoritarian ideas and politicians, even though in many and perhaps most cases, these people actually will end up harming their supporters?
I mean, I think there are lots of things. I think people are attracted to hope. And one of the things that all of these people say is, I will make things better for you. Now, they tend not to, but they promise it. I mean, Trump's constantly saying, I'm going to make America better than it's ever been. And he's tapping into people's feeling of loss of pride, loss of status, particularly, I think, loss of status, and promising to give it back. You're offering a scapegoat. You're offering a reason why things have gone wrong, which is usually wrong, whether it's immigrants or trans people or the evil Democrats or whatever it happens, or other people taking your healthcare, other people taking your resources. That is easy to understand and kind of gives you an outlet for the anger that people are feeling at the fact that their lives are pretty rubbish. I think for some people, the attraction is money. I think there are a lot of people get very rich out of autocracies. I mean, we saw it in Russia with the oligarchs. Right now in the US, there's a certain class of person who is making billions. I mean, the Trump family's made hundreds of billions of dollars just in the last year. I mean, it's quite insane if you look at it. So, there's that. And I think, in a world of complexity where everything's going a bit haywire, where there aren't any easy answers and there aren't any easy solutions to global conflict, to global warming, to inequalities, to the rise of kind of social media sound bites, it's very hard to kind of fight against that, because what populism does is it gives you easy answers and it gives you a way that it kind of sounds superficially right that people then can latch onto it, and then you can create this sense of belonging. And I think that's another thing which is just really hard, where often the opposition to it isn't unified. There isn't that same sense of belonging. It's fractured across all these different bits and people oppose different bits of it for different reasons. And then there's infighting and all the rest of it. That kind of sense of comfort of being part of a tribe isn't there. So, yeah, I mean, those are kind of my thoughts on it. As I said, it's not something I'm an expert on.
No, but you put that pretty eloquently. Thank you very much, Christina.
Well, thank you for having me.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Shimno Pidi No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Get us wherever you get your podcasts, and take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com if you like. Thank you so much, Christina. That was very interesting. And I'd really encourage everyone to subscribe to Christina's newsletter and to the Trump Tracker.
Well, thank you again.